They came back from the water with laughter in their pockets and sunburn on their necks, and one seat at the table empty. 7 summers passed, while everyone learned to pretend the absence was normal. Then Martinez Cooper's mother scraped a shoebox of faded Polaroids, found a phone bill with a single wrong number circled, and refused to stop asking why. That refusal turned a cold file into a hunt. Tonight, nearly a decade after Martinez vanished off a Key West Harbor cruise, the FBI calls the family at dawn, and the person they've trusted for years is let out in handcuffs. The arrest shocks an island that thought it knew its neighbors. But as the cuffs click closed, Martinez's sister opens a drawer and finds something that doesn't fit the neat story the police want to tell. Something that could mean this arrest is only the beginning. Before we dive deeper, take a second to hit that subscribe button and like the video. Your support keeps me going. Let me know in the comments below where you are watching from. They said she loved water more than most people loved breathing. Martinez Cooper had the kind of laugh blurred the edges of a room. She worked hard, saved for trips the way other people saved souvenirs, and took every chance to disappear into a horizon of blue. In the spring of 2004, she boarded a small sightseeing boat in Key West with 3 friends, a straw hat, and a newly minted sense of freedom. It was supposed to be a quick escape from the office and the weight of everyday chores, sun, sea, and the hushed, easy feeling of nowhere to be but the water. She never came back. The first night after Martinez didn't return, the police treated it at first like a runaway. She was 27, single, loved late-night margaritas and impulsive tattoos. The initial report, written on a blank-eyed shift change, said she might have left voluntarily. That assumption planted thorns. Her parents, Rosa and Hector Cooper, stared at the report until the letters smeared like salt on a window. Her sisters, Anna and Sophia, refused to accept the polite shrug of paper and protocol. They knew Martinez. They knew the keyed laugh that belonged to someone who wouldn't voluntarily vanish. Key West did what small towns do. It whispered. At the harbor, the rumor mill turned like the tide. Maybe she fell and was claimed by the sea. Maybe she left with someone she'd met. Maybe in the way of small towns and big griefs, it was better not to talk about it all. The local paper ran short column. The Coast Guard searched the night she disappeared, and for days afterward, divers crawled the underbellies of docks. Photos of Martinez in a sun-bleached dress and a crooked smile were printed in a dozen flyers and taped to poles. People left candles on the seawall. The Coopers refused to let the candles be decorative. They pestered. They held press meetings. They followed leads with the grim persistence of people who had nothing but truth to hold on to. The investigation that should have been immediate and fierce, however, curled at the edges under the strain of a sleepy department stretched thin. Fingerprints were lifted, statements were taken, and the boat that had been her last known location, a charter called the Mariner's Way, was briefly inspected before being returned to service. The boat's manifest, handwritten and stained with sunscreen, showed Martinez's name that afternoon. After that, the file grew dusty on a shelf. Days became months. Months became years. Pain took on ritual. The Friday calls that never came. The chair at the dinner table pulled in a little further. The holiday photo with a missing face. The Coopers learned to speak in practical sentences, funeral arrangements, unpaid bills, the logistics of grief, because those were the things that built scaffolding strong enough to keep them upright. Yet the scaffoldings of the world are porous. Friends will forget, co-workers will be promoted, and small towns will slip back into their rhythms. But the family who loses someone remains heir to a persistent, naked question. Who did this? And why? It was Anna who refused to leave the question alone. She taught school and kept her nights for poking at an unsyndicated truth. She scoured police report, filed public records requests, and cross-referenced names on the Mariner's Way manifest with local vendors and islands of memory. Men who drank at the same bar, mechanics who knew the boats, captains who logged the nights. She learned how to read the kind of handwriting that becomes a skeleton of an investigation. Scribble times, shorthand nicknames. A phone number smeared into illegibility by ocean spray and in different hands. By the 7th year, advances in forensics were catching up to old wounds. DNA analysis and the willingness of certain federal units to look again at unresolved disappearances breathed new life into the file. A cold case task force. Those slow-moving bureaucrats stitched from the seams of federal patience and long hours took the Cooper's case. The FBI arrived in a rented van with bright lights and a resolve that didn't need coffee refills. They listened to Anna's piecemeal pointing at 100 details with the same gravity that a surgeon examines a tiny cut, matter-of-fact, precise, a quiet kind of respect. They began to dig into evidence that had been preserved but not properly tested. Discarded cigarette butts that had been snapped into an envelope years earlier, a passenger list with an initial next to one name, and crucially, a swath of DNA recovered from the Mariner's Way's railing, a place where passengers leaned on the salt-worn wood and left microscopic signatures on the weathered grain. Chain of custody notes were poured over in fluorescent-lit rooms until someone realized an early mislabeling had led investigators down a dead end in 2005. That mistake, once corrected, made patterns emerge. The patterns pointed to a man most people in town assumed they knew. His name was Daniel Mercer. He owned a small boat repair shop near the harbor and had a reputation for being competent and forgetful in equal measures. He played Santa for the fishing tournaments, helping rig rods for kids, and he supplied diesel on credit to the Mariner's Way crew. He was the type of local who filled in at the church bingo nights and showed up to community meetings with the kind of smile that made him appear harmless. Anna remembered him as the man who had once fixed her sister's broken snorkeling mask and refused to take payment. He was on the manifest that afternoon, listed as crew/tech, and his name, when run through the updated database, matched DNA samples lifted from the railing. When the FBI moved, they moved with a quiet purpose that made the island hum. They did not burst into the shop with sirens. They spent weeks collecting samples, speaking to sailors, checking logs, and reconstructing the Mariner's Way's route that fateful afternoon. They interviewed passengers anew. They found an old breaker of a story, a bar fight, a closed-door argument between Daniel and a crew member months before Martinez vanished, a rumor once dismissed that a spot on the upper deck had been bright with a flare of voices the day she didn't return. Arrest in hand. The day the weather turned for the Coopers was an ordinary, cruelly bright Tuesday in late summer. The phone rang at 6:10 a.m. Rosa answered on instinct and listened as the words she'd rehearsed for 7 years, "We have an update," came out a voice that was not her daughter's. The FBI would not give details over the line. They promised presence, procedure, and the kind of logistical tenderness that masks its urgency. The cab ride across town felt like a slow-motion film. People watched the Cooper family come toward the harbor with the same curiosity and reverence they reserved for funerals and fireworks. The arrest itself was efficient and spare. Daniel was not a monstrous figure in the way headlines imagine monsters. He was stunned, then silent, then doggedly cooperative. He had the look of a man who had not expected to be called to answer for anything more than a missed invoice. Handcuffs clicked. A neighbor took a shaky video that would later ripple across the island's message boards. The community's first reaction was confusion. Daniel? Daniel had been a fixture. Neighbors who had once borrowed tools from him now felt the ground tilt. The idea that someone you waved to on the pier could be the person beneath the headlines was a disorienting, small-town betrayal. But arrests are not verdicts. The family knew that. An arrest meant a new chapter, but not closure. For 7 years, the Coopers had nourished a single hope, that someone would be held accountable. Now a man stood under the weight of that hope, and the island held its breath. The FBI pored over Daniel's history and found things that the public could not see in first blush. A patchwork of small suspensions for volatile behavior, a brief service in a coast-adjacent job where he'd had access to boats and records, and a personal life that was quieter than it should have been given his visibility. They also found an old injury to his hand documented in a clinic ledger, a detail that matched a repair job described by a passenger who had seen a blood-like smear on a deck step the day Martinez vanished. There were no confessions on a recorder. The evidence was quieter and less dramatic. Fibers, DNA matches, cell tower ping trails that placed a phone near the marina, witness statements that, when pieced together, drew a line between a laugh, a stumble, and a silence. Anna sat through the initial questioning with a thin, rehearsed fury. She watched the images on the news of Daniel being escorted from his shop and felt, at once vindicated and hollow. Rosa curled her hands in a prayer that was not religious so much as habitual, the mind's last muscle that works in private. Sophia, younger and more furious in her raw way, kept her hands busy opening envelopes of old letters and photos. Martinez, they knew, had been stubbornly alive in those things. A smile in February, an earring from a birthday not yet past. The family had prepared for this moment by living through years of expectation. They had not prepared for the complexity of seeing a man who fixed their neighbor's boat in the back of a marked car. In the weeks after the arrest, the island fractured into discrete camps. Some people attended vigils for Martinez and congratulated the Coopers for their perseverance. Others posted defenses of Daniel. He had community ties, they said. He'd helped with local charities. Surely the DNA could be contamination, they argued, playing the cautious role that small towns often adopt when a familiar face is accused. Friends of the accused insisted on presumption of innocence, as if that phrase could sue the family whose child had been gone for nearly a decade. The federal prosecutor called the evidence strong enough to bring charges, and the case that had been a cluttered stack of unanswered questions was suddenly a file with a spine. The press descended because it always does, for drama, for clicks, for empathy. They wanted to know the why, the human detail that could turn an everyman into a headline. The Coopers walked through the waves of cameras like people who have been told to breathe on command. They answered questions with calibrated honesty and kept the private parts of their grief close to their chests. But the story wound in on itself in ways the public did not expect. As investigators dug, they found that the Mariner's Way had scheduled a late-night private chart of the week after Martinez vanished, a booking that Daniel helped log. The captain's logs were not neat. They bore the handwriting of someone who'd been distracted and maybe frightened. An envelope tucked in a file cabinet contained a cassette tape, a relic from a time when onboard recorders were analog, with a grainy, muffled argument. The FBI, with the patience of modern technology, cleaned the audio until a voice could be identified. It was faint, but listeners could make out two voices and the distinct cadence of fear. The audio held a clue, mention of a backlocker and the word fix. The phrase that would later be replayed in court transcripts was simple and terrible. You can't just leave her out there. Daniel's defense, when assembled, was methodical. He admitted being on the Mariner's Way that day. He admitted he worked on small repairs for the boat. He denied any involvement in Martinez's disappearance and insisted the DNA had been transferred innocently. As a boat mechanic, he said, he touched many surfaces, many hands. That argument would be the hinge of the courtroom debate. Transfer versus direct contact. Still, arrests have another role beyond the courtroom. They force communities to reckon. They make people ask if kindness and utility can coexist with darker possibilities. People wondered how well they knew the man who fixed their motors. They looked for signs they'd missed, asked themselves the quiet, late question. Did I see something? The Coopers found themselves the reluctant moral center of a town that now wanted to perform its virtue and remake its memory so that it could continue to be a place with palm trees and charity bazaars. Through the legal motions, the family collected things that did not fit neatly into indictment packets. A strand of hair in a jacket Martinez was said to have borrowed hours before her disappearance, a torn scrap of fabric, an old voicemail that cut off mid-phrase. Anna insisted they keep everything. She'd learned the hard way that evidence did not always obey the neat rules written by detectives in thin blue lines. It hid in shoeboxes, in a shoelace tied the wrong way, in the smell of a coat kept in a closet for years. One evening, as the trial neared, Sophia found something in Martinez's things that made the room tilt. A folded receipt from a bar not far from the Mariner's Way dock, with an initial scrawled on the back. It was the same initial used in a captain's log. The receipt suggested Martinez had met someone new that afternoon, a man who'd paid with cash and left before anyone could write down a full name. It was a sliver of possible truth that complicated the single suspect narrative. If Martinez had been seen elsewhere with someone whose name they could not find, the defense could latch onto that thread and pull the case into doubt. The prosecution, however, had its own thread. An independent lab had reanalyzed a tiny set of fibers and found a match to a jacket in Daniel's shop, a jacket he claimed he'd never worn, but which had a repair tag bearing a stamp. The lab also matched DNA from the railing to Daniel with a high degree of probability. The FBI had by then compiled a constellation of small certainties. Each by itself might not have been damning. Together they formed a map that converged on a single point. On the morning the jury was selected, Key West felt heavy in a way the weather could not explain. Tourists took photos of pastel houses, oblivious, while locals avoided the pier. The courtroom filled with reporters, and the Coopers sat in a row, Rosa's hand twisted in a tissue, and Anna's jaw set like a vice. Martinez's photograph, the young woman in a sun-drenched dress, her hat tilted, her eyes smiling into the camera, hung like an accusation over the proceedings. Testimonies were surgical. Witnesses spoke of that day's energy, of a ripple in the usual hum of a harbor, of a moment when laughter turned brittle. Forensic experts explained polymerase chain reactions and allele frequencies in a language that softened when speaking about probabilities and hardened when delivering numbers. The defense tried to scrape at the seams: contamination, procedural errors, alternative theories. They called up men who remembered Daniel as helpful, temperate, a neighbor. They painted him as a man who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time for reasons that did not rise to guilt. But the prosecutor, patient and relentless, laid out a narrative that pulled together logs, pings, fibers, and behavior. They presented the cassette, the cleaned voices, the smears on the deck, and a pattern of inconsistencies in Daniel's timeline. The jury listened, sometimes bored, sometimes leaning forward as if trying to piece together a puzzle where the pieces had been shoved beneath the table. The press called it the case of the decade for Key West, a small island's long night dragged into a courtroom light, and then an unanticipated turn, just as the prosecution rested. A federal agent produced something the defense had not been given, an old maintenance ledger that contained a note about a broken hatch repaired by Daniel the week after the disappearance. It implied an attempt to fix something on the boat in a way that might point to concealment. The defense cried foul. The judge called a recess, and the room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and tension. Outside the courthouse window, the ocean tried to be indifferent, its surface catching light in flashes the color of old coins. People on the pier watched television bands cluster like gulls. In a bar not far from the harbor, arguments bloomed about justice, about the pace of truth, about whether the island could ever be the same. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the Cooper's kitchen, Rosa boiled water and let it cool. It seemed the most practical thing to do while waiting for the result of a life transformed. The entire family learned to measure time in small habits. The hour when the judge might call, the minute the TV anchor would speak. When the jury filed back in, they looked tired, as if the small island's entire moral weather had been shoved onto their shoulders. Guilty or not guilty. The verdict did not change what had already happened. Martinez was still gone. But the verdict mattered in a different register. It was a public accounting, an official reading of the record that either returned some comfort or cemented the injustice. The foreperson stood and read, "Not guilty." The room moved like a tide, rushing in. Daniel's shoulders sagged in relief, so deep it was almost a sound. The Cooper's world, which had been balanced on the edge of expectation for years, collapsed into a different shape entirely. The family sat stunned, their faces a map of exhaustion and betrayal. The prosecution announced they would appeal, but appeals do not redo the immediate sensation of loss. The island split open again. The defense's supporters celebrated vindication. Others felt fresh hurt at a system that had failed to punish someone they believed responsible. Yet even the not guilty verdict could not erase a deeper truth that had been uncovered over the course of the investigation. Martinez's last hours were not a clean narrative. They were a mesh of choices, columns of evidence pointing in different directions, half-remembered exchanges, and a complicity of small silences that had allowed one woman to slip from sight. The arrest had been real. The conviction had not. The family, exhausted and stubborn, refused to let the moment become an epilogue. Anna found the drawer. It was an old rolling toolbox Martinez had kept in her apartment for keys and spare change. Tucked at the bottom, behind a stack of Polaroids, was a folded scrap of paper, a receipt Martinez had kept from the day she vanished. On the back of the receipt, someone had written a single sentence in a hurried hand. The sentence read, "If anything happens to me, check the storage locker at Dock 3, blue plastic crate." It was unsigned. Anna's heart dropped like a stone. The storage lockers at Dock 3 were mundane things, places fishermen kept nets, where spare ropes lived, where men stored the tools of their trade. But a blue plastic crate held the possibility of something not yet unearthed, something physical, immediate, and unexamined. The Coopers took the receipt to the FBI and watched the agents lean in. There was no guarantee anything remained in Dock 3. The harbor had changed hands, crates had been moved over the years, storms had come and gone. But the receipt belonged to Martinez, and the sentence was not the sort of thing you invent. It had urgency and the type of fear that sits like a hot coal in a throat. 2 days later, under sky so clear it felt obscene, the FBI opened the storage locker at Dock 3. Beneath a stack of old life preservers and a rusted anchor, they found a blue plastic crate. Inside was a small camcorder, its battery long dead, but the tape was intact. On the tape, after hours of grainy footage of the harbor at dusk, was a single clip, Martinez laughing into the camera, then an off-screen voice saying, "We'll take care of it," and Martinez answering with a nervous smile the camera captured like confession. "I don't want to be alone." The audio was clear at the end. A name was spoken softly, a name that matched none of the people who had been tried or suspected before. The tape was not a confession, and it was not a confessionless truth. It was a clue that opened a door. The name whispered into the camcorder did not match Daniel's, and yet the FBI could not say, publicly, what the tape implied. The community braced for another wave of disclosures, and the Coopers learned the uncomfortable anatomy of prolonged hoping. Arrests can be hollow, verdicts can be imperfect, but evidence, new, untidy, stubborn, has a way of returning like tidewater. Key West felt raw again, a place where music and grief live side by side. People prayed, ate, gossiped, and wondered. The arrest had shocked the community. The not guilty verdict had unsettled it, and the new tape had stoked a different fear, that the truth was more complicated and that the person who had been taken into custody might only be part of a darker story. Anna sat at the kitchen table with the blue plastic crate's corroded lid in her hands. She thought of Martinez stepping onto the deck that day, hat in hand, ready to lean into the wind. She thought of the small, stubborn sentence on the back of a receipt that had been Martinez's last quiet attempt at self-protection. She thought of how the family had learned to measure love by the muscles of insistence, how persistence could be the most ordinary weapon available to those who grieve. The final image is not a resolution, but a movement. The FBI, now with a new lead, prepares to follow a name whispered into an old camcorder. The community, stunned, fractured, furious, faithful, watches as investigators map out a route that could lead them across state lines. The arrest that shocked the island was only a hinge. Behind it, drawers still contain secrets. Docs still hold lost tapes. And the people who knew Martinez best still carry the stubborn conviction that truth, however delayed, is owed to her. Outside, the harbor darkens and a breeze picks up, lifting the smell of salt and diesel. A boat's light cuts a low ribbon across the water. In the Coopers' living room, a photograph of Martinez looks like a promise. A woman who loved the water more than most people loved breathing, and whose absence became a life's work for those who loved her. The story pauses at the edge of what comes next: an arrest, a verdict, a tape, a name, and then continues, because this is not a neat tale but a living one. And the next page has yet to be turned. The night closes with the sound of waves and something else. The faint, steady scratch of a pen as Anna writes yet another letter, sending it to an address she hopes will answer. The cliffhanger is not a twist so much as an open door. Someone else had been named on a tape found in a blue crate at Dock 3. The FBI has that name. The island waits. The Cooper family waits. And somewhere, a truth that has been patient for 11 years shifts toward daylight. If you think this is the end, you are wrong. The sea keeps secrets, but it does not keep them forever. They came back from the tape with a name and the breathless, terrible certainty that a whisper could become a map. The name Anna had written down in the margin of the FBI's report, Elias Marlowe, felt to her like a thing both brittle and dangerous. Elias Marlowe was a man whose charity dinners were the sort of headline the island loved. A man with a laugh that filled rooms and a face that photographers used when they wanted community. He owned Marlowe Marine, the company that had refurbished the Mariner's Way's engine the winter before Martinez vanished. He'd given a generous donation to the Harbor Restoration Project and had been photographed at the ribbon cutting beside the mayor. If someone had ever drawn a Venn diagram of influence in Key West, Elias sat at the intersection. The FBI moved quietly for weeks, the way a net moves when the fishermen talk about tides. Agents traced Marlowe's travel, subpoenaed his phone records, and sifted through ledgers that had once been dusted over by preferential ledger keeping. They interviewed dockhands who years earlier had nicknamed Elias the Fixer because he fixed not just boats but problems that people didn't want their names attached to. In almost every small town, the comfortable and the complicit have an ambiguous seam. Sometimes kindness is a currency traded for silence. When agents knocked on Marlowe's front door at dawn, he opened it as if to let in the morning, and the waver of his face, confident, surprised, then controlled, was almost theatrical. He agreed to speak. He declined a lawyer at first, then accepted one with the practiced politeness of men who have something to hide but still want to look respectable while doing it. The FBI brought him in, and investigators took methodical inventory of his properties. Anna watched the day Marlowe's storage unit was opened on a pier like a small stage. They found, toward the back, beneath covered buoys and crates, a small black box. Inside was a single item: Martinez's left earring, the one she had worn in the photograph the family had of her on the Mariner's Way. It was a tiny thing, a cheap hoop with a missing clasp. But to Anna, it was a lighthouse. The lab tested it, and it matched the metallurgy of other items found that linked back to Martinez's belongings. On a separate shelf in the storage, beneath a canvas tarp, they found a blue plastic crate, the same shade as the one from Dock 3. It was emptied. Someone had moved what had been in it. Marlowe sat across from an agent and watched the images on the screen. He remained calm until they played the clip for the recovered camcorder in the blue crate. Martinez's voice, the off-screen male voice, saying, "We'll take care of it," a tone that could be read a dozen ways on its face. But the context burned it into something monstrous. That male voice, the agents argued quietly among themselves, matched Marlowe's mannered timbre. His hands, steady on the table, betrayed nothing, but a small, almost imperceptible tightening near the eyes gave Anna the sensation of a puppet whose strings had been pinched. When the FBI arrested Marlowe, the island woke in the slow way it does, first as rumor in coffee shops, then as black-hooded vans on the television screens in the laundromat, and finally as a line of federal agents escorting a man in cuffs past a harbor that had known him for years. He didn't go quietly, no one did, but neither did he fight. The handcuffs translated the unanswerable into a sudden manufactured clarity. There was now a man the government would hold up and say, "We have evidence." For the Coopers, the sensation was complex. Vindication braided with dread. They had wanted someone to answer for Martinez's disappearance for 11 years. They had not wanted the person who bore the town's applause to be the one. Marlowe's indictment was a shock measured in numbered documents: conspiracy to commit obstruction, tampering with evidence, and ultimately the charge that cut deepest, a charge that implied not just a single act, but a plan to erase Martinez. The prosecution's opening was clinical and devastating. Marlowe had the motive, control, reputation, the slow accrual of power in which people are invisible until they threaten the comfortable, and the means, access to boat storage and a network of favors. But the prosecution's paper trail was longer than narrative could easily bear. It revealed payments to a contractor who'd done late-night concrete work near the marina, to a man with a small boat who had no accounting for the mornings he'd been missing, to a harbor master who'd signed off on things he should not have. The pattern looked less like a single act and more like a system. Small favors repaid, a leash of debt and gratitude that could be pulled tight. People who had once smiled in photographs with Elias wrote statements that were different in ink than in memory. Hushed, objecting, at times ashamed. The mayor's office found itself on the defensive. The local paper that for years had printed happy photos of ribbon cuttings now printed subpoenas. The Harbor Committee's minutes were released, and the names threaded across them read, like a who's who of the island's stewardship. The community's protective narrative of a place that took care of its own began to unravel. You don't just indict a fixer. You indict a pattern of deference. What the prosecution did not fully anticipate was the depth of the wound this would open in the Coopers. The arrest energized hopes, but also invited spectators. The family, always visible in the background of coverage, became icons of pain. Cameras lingered on faces that did not want to be on camera. Rosa, who had spent the years since Martinez's disappearance moving like a ghost through the ordinary tasks of love, tried to keep her ritual of setting the table each night. But ritual is brittle when the ground shifts beneath it. Every time an agent called, or a reporter knocked, or a neighbor mentioned Elias's name, her breath caught as if straws had been stuffed in her throat. In the second month of detention, with Marlowe refusing to give up more than carefully worded statements about his involvement, something else happened. Something that would be the hinge of the second act. A letter arrived at the prosecutor's office, unmarked, handwritten, and brief. If you want the rest, it read, "Check the foundation of the East Bay project before the concrete dries. I buried what I had to. H. They checked the East Bay project. The East Bay project was a thin, gleaming promise. Luxury condos, sweeping windows, the kind of future that cities sell to the wealthy to subsidize small-town nostalgia. The project had been spearheaded by Grady Hayes, a developer whose family had a long history of civic involvement and whose photo one could find in more than one mayor's campaign brochure. If the letter was truthful, it meant the dirt beneath a nascent skyline might hold the body of a girl from a photo. The request to halt construction read like a crack in the public narrative. Developers threatened suit. The mayor called for calm. Investors fretted. But the judge, under federal watch and with the press hovering like a flock of predatory birds, ordered a pause. Excavation began. The first days were practical. Heavy machinery, lawyers with hard faces, and layers of earth turned like pages. The camera crews clustered at a respectful distance. The Coopers stood in the rain, the salt in the air tasting like something preordained. What they found shook the island to its center. A human skeleton, partially articulated and wrapped in fabric that time had softened to a pale brown. Dental records were pulled with a speed that felt at once clinical and intimate. Because the most private things come out when an official requests them. The match was unmistakable. Martinez Cooper was finally named in official terms, and the name landed in the Coopers' ears like a verdict. The discovery produced the reaction the prosecution needed to secure more charges. Grady Hayes' name, which had been a whisper in town halls and private texts, was now in the indictment. It was a reality that no one had wanted. The body had been entombed beneath the foundation slab that would have supported the East Bay condos. The evidence suggested a late-night burial, a coordination of men who knew how to have things undone. The indictment argued that Elias Marlowe had not acted alone, that he'd acted with the aid, if not the protection, of those who had the most to lose from scandal. Once the news hit the island, Key West became a small city transformed into a courtroom and a disaster simultaneously. People who had been politically neutral found themselves shouting at council meetings. The harbor, once the island's living room, became a place people avoided. Local business faltered. The handful of people who had spoken up during the investigation began to receive threats. They shut down their social media, uninstalled comment sections, avoided the peers. The town sense of itself, tolerant, generous, indulgent, began to feel, to many, like naivete. In the weeks following the excavation, a different kind of violence visited the Coopers. The weight of the bodies, discovery unlatched something in Rosa. She had been the steadiest of the family, a woman whose grief for 11 years had been a practice thing. When she saw Martinez's teeth charted in a paper the coroner handed her, her knees folded like a ladder rungs gone wrong. She collapsed into Anna's arms in a public hallway outside the morgue. There was a medical explanation: stress-induced cardiomyopathy. The doctors would say later, a heart that can no longer keep its rhythm in the face of shock. But in immediate moments, there was simply the sound of the family being raw in a way the cameras could not salvage. Rosa died 2 days later, in the hospice room where the family had gathered. They were present: Anna, Sophia, Hector, and they held her hands. The death certificate would say natural causes exacerbated by extreme stress. The funeral home would do its gentle work. But the blackness that came into the house when Rosa's bed was made empty was heavy in a moral way that made every local action feel a betrayal. People in town felt weirdly guilty, as if their casual purchases at the farmer's market had somehow contributed to an ecosystem that had buried a girl. The grief that followed was now multi-generational, sorrow layered upon sorrow. The community's reaction to Rosa's death was explosive. Vigils turned into confrontations with city officials at economic forums. Protesters put up makeshift memorials on the East Bay construction site, and someone painted in large letters across the project's temporary plywood fence, "Where is the town soul?" The town's tourism board issued bland statements about respecting the judicial process, while the mayor issued a short apology that sounded like a draft. The national press arrived, their cameras hungry for the image of a small city falling apart. And yet, even with a body, arrests, and an official narrative that seemed to point toward culpability, justice did not land like a clean blade. The prosecution moved forward, and Grady Hayes was arraigned. But the more the trial dug at the threads of evidence, bank transfers, late-night calls, payments to contractors, the more the system reminded everyone that truth in court is a different thing than truth at the kitchen table. Friends of Grady produced a different biography. Charitable contributions, scholarships funded in his family's name, a foundation that paid for free clinics. Defense attorneys argued reasonable doubt, contamination, and conspiracy. The island watched as wealthy lawyers parsed the lives of people who were dead and those still living. In the middle of waiting for trial, the young man who'd been the harbor master, Marcus, who had once been a friend of Cooper's and had testified about being asked to move buoys on an odd night, was found dead in his truck. The coroner ruled it an overdose. Rumors spun in neighborhoods like tattered sheets in a storm. Murder, guilt, inability to sleep. The town had become saturated with the idea that anyone who edged too close to the truth might be consumed by it. The Coopers, in the center of the storm, had to choose what to do with what they had reclaimed. Martinez's remains were returned to them. The funeral was small, the way Rosa would have wanted. Sand underfoot, friends who endured, a handful of reporters at the perimeter like predatory birds who knew when to keep distance. Ana read a poem Martinez had loved, and Hector, gone from stress and sleepless nights, spoke of a daughter who had loved the perfect tilt of sunlight on the water. They sent Martinez out to sea with a scattering of rose petals and a song the family had sung since childhood. Just as the community thought the tide might begin to recede, the final blow came. Before the trial could deliver a verdict, a judge dismissed key pieces of evidence on technical grounds. Chain of custody errors, improper warrant language. The defense's motions ate at the seams of the prosecution's case in a way that had nothing to do with whether something was true and everything to do with legal precision. The courtroom became a place where technicality outranked narrative. Grady walked out of an initial hearing and into the warm night with the same measured smile that had once graced brochures. For the Coopers that evening the world shrank until it was nothing but a hollowed echo. They had summoned truth from the ground, and the truth had answered. But the system that was supposed to translate truth into justice failed them again. Families in small towns sometimes measure their lives in the spaces where systems fail. They build their days around scaffolding of sorrow and the small acts of survival. The Coopers continued because what else could they do? But the seams of them were frayed. Hector took to driving to the harbor at midnight and staring at the water until his eyes burned. Ana stopped teaching for a while and spent her days meeting with other families who'd lost people to small-town negligence. Sophia closed her social media. Key West was not the same. Where once there had been jaunty postcards promoting sunsets, there were now op-eds about accountability and a defiant community art project that listed the names of victims the town had lost to its blind spots. The harbor smelled the same. The water lapped the same. But people walked differently. They carried the knowledge that the glittering life that made the island beautiful had been built, in part, on the backs of people who had been made invisible. The last scene of this part of the story is not dramatic in the legal sense. There was no climactic showdown, no public confession on a courthouse lawn. The final image that lingered for months was a quiet one. Anna standing on the seawall where years earlier she had affixed Martinez's flyers. The camera, which had once panned over the harbor's sunlit promise, found her small in the frame. She held in her hands an envelope and a photograph. The photograph was of Martinez, laughing in the sun, the brim of her hat crooked, the world open. The envelope contained a single piece of paper, a receipt worn and folded, and a sentence scrawled in a handwriting only Martinez had used. "If anything happens to me, check the storage locker at Dock 3. Anna pressed the photograph to her chest. She had her sister's remains, the evidence of a garden dug and filled, an island shaken and rearranged by the revelation of what power had cost them. She had a city that would never quite trust itself again. She had the circuitous mercy of a truth that had come too late to save a mother's heart. She had no justice, not the kind that arrives with the din of gavels and the slam of doors. She had instead the slow, private justice of having placed a name where a phrase of absence had been. When the sun sank that evening, it did so in a way that looked to any postcard maker like the same one it had always been. But Key West felt altered, and those who had called it home for years carried a small, terrible knowledge that the beauty you can sell can hide the truth you cannot ignore, that grief sometimes arrives in a dossier, that sometimes the person you trust to fix the harbor is the one who knows where the bodies are buried. The city would be shocked. It would be angry. It would hold hearings and hire outside counsel. And some faces in official positions would leave in disgrace. A few stubbornly would keep their jobs. But when journalists left and the temporary plywood fences were replaced, and the East Bay project continued under new investor, the Coopers would remain in town with a hole even the most exact legal accounting could not quite fill. At night, Anna would sometimes walk to the pier and stand alone, the photograph of Martinez in her pocket like a talisman, and listen to the water. It answered in the same indifferent rhythm it always had, as if to say that the sea takes and keeps and that everything else, arrests, evidence, verdicts, funerals, must find its place beside that immutable fact. The story continues because there's more to tell. The appeal processes, the slow churning of indictments, the social reckonings. But this chapter closes on an island that knows what it once refused to know, and a family that has gotten what it asked for at a price they had not imagined. They had their answers. They had their daughter back. What they did not have was a clean ending. That would be the part that the city would have to live with. And in that living, the true devastation would be measured. A mother gone before justice could be fully done, a town soul shaken, and a family left to gather the shards of their lives into something that might, in time, be called living again. Going out on the water should feel like a little gift to yourself. Sun on your face, wind that thinks it owns your hair, the steady, slow exhale that only comes when you look at a horizon. Those are the reasons we go. At the same time, loving the sea doesn't mean we ignore its rules. The best trips combine wonder with a quiet, steady respect. Here's how to protect yourself and those you love without spoiling the magic. Before you go, tell someone you trust your exact plan. Departure time, boat name, the captain's name or company, and the expected return. Leave a quick written note or message with an emergency contact. Check the weather and the forecasted sea conditions. Even pretty days can change fast. Small craft advisories matter. Research the operator. Look for licensing, recent reviews, and that the boat carries safety equipment. A professional crew will happily show you their safety gear and certificates. That's a good sign. Pack a tiny safety kit. Fully charged phone in a waterproof case, portable charger, basic medications, a whistle, sunscreen, and a small flashlight. Bring a sweater. The wind gets colder than you think. On the boat, listen to the safety briefing like it's the most important song on the playlist. Knowing where life jackets, exits, and fire extinguishers are is not boring. It's brave. Wear a life jacket if you're asked to, or if comfort requires it. A properly fitted life jacket is the simplest, smartest piece of gear you can have. Stay in groups and let someone know if you're stepping away to explore the dock or speak privately with another passenger. Trust your instincts. If a situation feels off, remove yourself and tell the crew. Limit drinking. Alcohol dulls your judgment and slows reactions. Keep clear-headed choices for when the sea demands them. Keep valuables secure and minimal. Snap a photo of IDs and important contacts, and leave originals in a safe place if possible. If something feels wrong, speak up. Tell a crew member what you noticed. It's always okay to be cautious. Use location sharing. Set a trusted contact to see your live location for the duration of the trip. If a person's behavior alarms you, get near the captain or other staff. The crew's job is safety. The right captain will act quickly and decisively. Emergency basics. Know how to signal for help. Whistle phone call or distress call from the boat's radio. Keep the phone charged and accessible. If someone goes overboard, stay calm, point the person so rescuers know who to look for, and follow crew instructions. Learn a few basic first aid and CPR steps. Confidence is its own kind of safety. After the cruise, tell a friend you're safely back. Share any concerns you had with the operator so future passengers are safer. Keep memories, photos, laughs, small souvenirs, and also keep the lessons. Preparation and communication are the best souvenirs of all. Finally, be present. Let the sea do its quiet work on you. Breathe, laugh, hold hands, and look up. Being careful doesn't take away the wonder. It protects it. Go with a plan, travel with a buddy, and come home with stories. The ocean gives us so much. A little preparation helps us return to it again and again, safely. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and turn on the notification bell so you stay updated with mystery cold cases. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Thanks for watching.